Hi out there. We're broadcasting live here at Union Docks in Brooklyn. But before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the territory of the Lenape. This acknowledgement should not function as closure, resignation, or acceptance of the structural conditions of settler colonialism that remain in effect today. Union Docs will continue to ask what it means for us to keep open a spirit of sustained inquiry into the complexities of our situation. Hi, I'm Jenny. I'm the co-artistic director here at Union Docs.
And I'm Juan Pedro. I'm the operations manager here.
We're so excited tonight to be hosting an inside look at the Heist podcast in this glamorous setting of the Union Docs office. Host Sally Herships has put together an amazing lineup here of the contributors to the series to help walk us through its craft.
Sally's been a long-time collaborator at Union Docs, the fearless leader of our longest running workshop, Radio Boot Camp. Our first ever online session is taking place this weekend, and there are a few spots left. If you want to nail down the basics of podcasting, snag one of these last remaining seats.
And if you're new to Union Docs, welcome. We host events like these that explore the wide spectrum of documentary art, including radio and podcasts, but also film and video, performance, and interdisciplinary work too. And we also host a series of workshops. Coming up, we have magical realism in documentary and a weekend exploring Afrofuturism. These workshops are always focusing on a very specific practice in documentary art, and we usually have about 2 a month.
We also produce work, hosting 3 labs each year. We just began our fall collaborative studio exploring urgent political media making.
And there's more too. The best way to stay in touch with us is to get on our mailing list or find us on social media at Union Docs. We hope to keep in touch.
Yeah. The Heist is a story of a huge political swindle, of how it happened and how power works in the Donald Trump presidency.
Reporters spent months behind the scenes. We get to know a big Republican donor, a senator who caves to political pressure, and the enigmatic Secretary of the Treasury, Steven Mnuchin, who led the charge for these laws.
And that's what tonight is about. It's actually about getting to hear from all the other people involved in the making of a podcast like this. We're going to hear from the composer, editors, and producers, the folks who you don't normally get to hear on air.
So first, we're going to hand it over to Sally, and she's going to introduce Nina Perry, the composer, who's running us all the way from London. It's super late at night there. So we're going to start with Nina, and then we'll hear from the rest of the team. So hope you guys have a great time.
Hope you enjoy. Thanks for tuning in.
Hope you enjoy. Thanks.
So to introduce Nina Perry, she is a composer extraordinaire. She has composed beautiful music for what she calls composed features for BBC documentaries. She has recorded giant icebergs, thought about good timing, and captured one of my favorite pieces of hers, captured the surprising emotion and significance of the supermarket, her beautiful piece, The Supermarket Symphony. And I would love to give listeners or viewers a sense of what her work was like by playing a piece of her reporting before her music and then after her music became a part of it. So can you play for us the clip of the Steven Mnuchin tape without music?
You may have seen this photo. It went viral. It's the one where Steven Mnuchin, he's Secretary of the Treasury, and his wife Louise Linton are at the Bureau of Engraving. She's got a blonde ponytail and she's dressed all in black, including long leather gloves. And they're holding up sheets of money, grinning. Here's Mnuchin on Fox News talking about it.
Mr. Secretary, some folks say that you two look like 2 villains from a James Bond movie. I'm sure you've heard that. I guess my question is, what were you thinking?
I heard that. I never thought I'd be quoted as looking like villains from the James Bond. I guess I should take that as a compliment that I look like a villain in a great, successful James Bond movie. But
this guy is our Secretary of the Treasury. And when he was sworn in, Trump was in salesman mode.
Stephen, I want to congratulate you. A lot of people wanted that position, Stephen. A lot of people. A lot of very successful people. But I've known you for a long time, and I know how smart you are and how great you will be for our country. So congratulations to you, to Louise, and to your whole family. Americans should know that Stephen, our nation's financial system, is truly in great hands. With him, we're going to have no problem, believe me. Once again.
But that's not what happened. Under Mnuchin and the Trump administration, economic inequality has been growing like it's on steroids.
So that was our reporting before Nina's music. And now let's play the same clip with Nina's music laid in.
You may have seen this photo. It went viral. It's the one where Stephen Mnuchin, he's Secretary of the Treasury, and his wife Louise Linton are at the Bureau of Engraving. She's got a blonde ponytail and she's dressed all in black, including long leather gloves. And they're holding up sheets of money, grinning. Here's Mnuchin on Fox News talking about it.
Mrs. Secretary, some folks say that you two look like two villains from a James Bond movie. I'm sure you've heard that. I guess my question is, what were you thinking?
I heard that. I never thought I'd be quoted as looking like villains from the James Bond. I guess I should take that as a compliment that I look like a villain in a great, successful James Bond movie. But let me just say,
this guy is our Secretary of the Treasury. And when he was sworn in, Trump was in salesman mode.
Stephen, I want to congratulate you. A lot of people wanted that position, Stephen. A lot of people. A lot of very successful people. But I've known you for a long time, and I know how smart you are and how great you will be for our country. So congratulations to you, to Louise, and to your whole family. Americans should know that Stephen, our nation's financial system, is truly in great hands. With him, we're going to have no problem, believe me. Once again.
But that's not what happened.
So, Nina, I guess I want to start with how do you do that? How do you start writing music about taxes?
Well, I think the starting point was really great conversations with you, Sally, I think, to start with, and like getting a feel for what the stories were going to be about and a particular tone and finding an identity. And then it was sort of like piecing little bits together. I think when I had the very first conversation with you, I had the thought of, a string, something a bit classy. And then I was like, maybe it needs to be a bit dark and edgy through our conversations. And then I think then we started talking about power quite a lot, and how do you do power that isn't sounding necessarily like it's really like overpowering power? How do you signify power?
And something I think I'm really curious about, I think a really common way of working, at least here in the States, is to work on your production and then at a certain point go to like Blue Dot sessions or something, pull some music, and then kind of try to make it fit. Do you want to talk a little bit about how the process of working with a composer and then real live musicians, right? Like you work with human musicians. How is that different than this other way of working?
Well, it's like make something that's integral. So the music probably doesn't really, and maybe it would work without, separately, but its purpose is to help tell the story. And the way that I hope that it is doing that is firstly by giving that sense of identity, and then also maybe hinting at things that you can't say in words, or giving emotion that is maybe not obvious, or supporting emotion in some places. And I think early on I remember looking at The Godfather, and it was about the juxtaposing something that you would think was obvious, so you don't necessarily want it to fit. That does something, you feel a bit uncomfortable with that. And I'm really lucky to work with some really fantastic musicians who I was creating everything in electronically, and then Sally and I have been like passing backwards and forwards, and then it gets to the stage where it is transformed into notes and then played, and then we also had the lockdown situation happening as well, and so some of it was done remotely, some of it was done together, and then lots of squashing it all together, and yeah, so
And I want to play another clip in a minute, because what you were talking about, how music can bring to life some of the things that we don't say in words, I think is really interesting and important. And but before we do that, I would love for you to talk a little bit more about the process of working with a composer and real musicians, because it is just on a very basic level, because people who are watching might be wondering, like, how do I make a podcast? One thing that you can do if you're working with pre-recorded music, it's sort of easy to make changes at the last minute, right? You could just like delete a piece of music, add a piece of music. What is involved? How is that process different than it working with you, with a composer in general?
Well, you can still do it, but it just takes a time, because everything is tailored exactly. And I think also when working with a timeline with sound, it's everything is about the timing. So you sort of work things out like very, very precisely to the tiniest of seconds, and then when changes happen, it's like, oh, well, the timing has changed, changes the music, then okay, then down the line somebody has to like change the notes, and then the musician has to play the note differently, and then if you have to redo it all, you can still, we in here, we did a bit of both. We did some re-recording, and we did some editing as well. I edited bits as well to
being very nice.
Rework.
I think you're being very nice. I think you called it juggling elephants when we were making changes, right?
Yeah, it was it was just like the most complicated puzzle of like moving things around the timeline. So the speech and everything like in the program had changed, but then I had all of these, if you imagine all these files below of all these layers of music that I was trying to move around, and trying to keep the integrity of the timing and keep the music so it worked. So it was like elephant juggling. Yeah.
I know we have a picture from working with you in the past. I learned about this magical document called a cue sheet. Friends at Union Docs, we have a screenshot, there it is, of the cue sheet. Nina, can you tell us, what is this and how do producers use this to work with a composer? What is this cue sheet?
Well, it's sort of how we've done it. So, it's something that's used in film all the time, less so in radio and podcasting, perhaps. But it's really helpful especially at the mixing stage, to know where the cue starts and where it ends. And so it can be lined up. So I think with these ones, I did it right at the end as a sort of as we were handing it over to Peregrine to be mixed. But yes, it's something that can be built as you go along as well. It's quite useful to be creating that. Depends how you like to work as well, I think. But
just to provide folks with some extra vocab. So cue, I've learned, and maybe I'm wrong, you can tell me, cue means the actual, it's the piece of music that you're going to use at that moment in time. So here at this cue sheet, the pieces of music that Nina composed to hit different moments, as she mentioned, were timed right to the second, like 6 minutes and 1 second, or let's see, speech in Trump, when he says practicing social distancing. And then when the speech ends, as you know, we launched the Paycheck Protection Program. And then there's the timing, 14 seconds and 1 minute and 30 seconds. So everything is timed precisely. And that's why when you start moving that stuff around, it becomes, like Nina says, juggling elephants. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. And then I think within, you know, you're changing things within that time. So the timing changes as well. So there's lots of, you know, it's to get it to flow. You want it to sound right. So you have to change the timing. I just realized I've got here, this is some of the actual music. This is, we're talking about the episode 2 Q1, which is probably what we played, but this might be the first version, and that's the cello part of the music. So that's, sorry, Sally.
Can you hold that up again to the camera? Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So all of those things are then transferred. That this is Danny, who's the cellist. That was his scoring. So I handed it over to him as I was writing music for other things, and he's really good at doing that. So, yeah.
So what would you say to somebody who's working on a podcast and says, we'll do the music last and we'll just go get some?
Well, try it, you know, and also try and work with a composer, you know, compare those things. If you're just starting out, it can be a really wonderful collaborative, you know, exercise to work with somebody, to explore how you can tell stories, because it's basically about telling stories, and how can music help you tell your story to the best. And you're working in sound, so composers live through their ears, you know. Musicians live through their ears, so you know there's a different, there could be something else that this person could bring. I mean, I always really enjoy working with you, Sally, because it's such a creative process as well. You know, it's collaborative. It's like, yeah, I've written, but you know, you gave me notes down to the second as well, and lots of detail. So it is very much a collaborative. It's very much a collaborative piece.
So I would like to play another clip of Nina's music. This is gonna be, we'll hear it in a moment. So friends at Union Docs, I would love to hear in a minute or share with the audience this clip, this cue of music that Nina wrote about Louise Linton. And this is, I think, a really great example. So this episode is about Steven Mnuchin, the Secretary of the Treasury. And I kind of went down a rabbit hole trying to figure out who he is. And then he has this fascinating wife number 3. You'll hear a little bit about her. And we couldn't really, it would have not been appropriate to spend a lot of time on his wife because the podcast is about him, but she's a very interesting character. And I think Nina's music really added a lot. It helped to sort of inform the listener about who she is and say some of the things we were not able to say. So let's go ahead and play this clip of this little tiny section of Louise Linton. And just a little more context, this is a reporter who covers Hollywood, because Steven Mnuchin, in case you didn't know, was a big investor in major Hollywood blockbusters like the Lego movie and Batman. I can't remember, one of the, maybe, oh no, that is the Lego movie. Anyway, enough with that. Let's hear the clip.
Kim says there are parties on yachts, private jets, Eastern European oligarchs.
Lots of women. Under what circumstances? Lots of rumors, lots of partying.
And it's at one of those parties that Steven Mnuchin meets his third and current wife, Louise Linton.
You know, there's an expression in Hollywood, model, actress, whatever. You know, Louise Linton is actress, producer, whatever, right?
And there's something else about Mnuchin's time in Hollywood. A lot of the movies he backed, lots of them had pretty liberal themes.
Great. So let me see, I have this list of questions. So I thought that was a really cool example because there were a lot of allegations about this character and Mnuchin's time in Hollywood, but like I said, things that we couldn't necessarily get into for time or for other reasons. And I think your music did such a beautiful job of capturing that and painting that picture. The last question I wanted to ask you was, what was it like to work on a podcast during a pandemic with about the president's tax policy with a team in a different country?
It was amazing, actually. It was sort of like, I think, because one thing, I was thinking about this earlier, one thing that the pandemic tends to do is make you sort of quite inward, you know, the isolation and being inside. And to be hearing what was happening, you know, in just conversations or emails, conversations and meetings and things, what was happening on the ground, on the other side of the Atlantic was really good to you know, to have that connection and to feel you can still work. You know, we were going to be working like this anyway, so and I was, you know, but also the intensity of the subject matter was that I've learned so much about American politics, and it was quite dark at times listening to this over and over and again, and listening to Trump over and over again, you know, like hearing these voices over and over again while I was doing it was quite intense. But one thing was that I, like, woven in, you know, in the middle of lockdown, my neighbor was boxing outside, and while I was writing the music, I was doing this drumming sound, and the boxing was, I was like, oh, that's really good. So I went and recorded his boxing, and that is woven in. It was just like, it was sort of inspired this sort of like the power sound that I was looking for. So that was just a lockdown thing, really. I couldn't go out anywhere else to get sound. So
amazing. Well, it is about 5 hours later where you are, Nina. So I'm curious to know if there are any questions from any of you out there for Nina. Maybe we'll ask her to stick around for just another few minutes because it is 10:30 at night in London. And so if you have questions, please share them, and we'll pop back in with Nina with questions for a few minutes. Nina, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's been great to talk about it.
So the next kind of backstage voices that I wanted to introduce to the audience are the editors. And we have a bunch of really amazing editors. And the first editor that I wanted to introduce is Alan Holmes from the Center for Public Integrity. And he is a digital editor, and he is the Tax Project editor. So before we did this podcast, the Center for Public Integrity had spent 2 years, I believe, really doing amazing intensive reporting. And Alan was the editor on this project and had done some amazing work. Alan, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Okay, I guess my first question for you, why a podcast about taxes?
Yeah, I know. If you're going to start your first podcast, as we did at Public Integrity, I don't think taxes would be top of on the list. But this is what we do at the center is we look at how access to power and wealth influence policy and creates inequality. That's basically what we do. So one of the most telling ways that the wealthy do that is through the tax system. And if you think taxes are boring, I can introduce you to many, many billionaires who want you to continue to think that, because then they can go off and do things that seem complicated, boring, but in the end create this incredible gap in wealth. So, and what I liked, what I heard from Nina is that, and this is something that, you know, you, Sally had talked about is, and it kind of came out with the tagline is, you know, this is how power works in Trump's America. And one of the things that came through in Nina's music and what you were just talking about is trying to get down to the power. This is all about power, and it's really important stuff, but you have to tell it in a way that isn't going to be just listened to by accountants, tax attorneys. It really has to come alive. So that's why we chose taxes, because it's where the power is in Washington.
Okay, so all right, I'm sold on the taxes. Obviously, I was sold. Next question. You had done 2 years of incredibly intensive, detail-packed investigative reporting, full of numbers, statistics, and dollar signs. How do you take these digital text articles, of which there were very many, because when I first started working with you guys, I printed them out and they were like this thick. The pile was this thick, and
Yeah, 20 plus, more than 20, yeah.
Yeah. How do you take those and transform them into a 5-part audio podcast? Because it's a totally different type of storytelling.
Well, that's why we hired you. It's because we knew we didn't have the talent on staff. We knew we had all these great stories. We had characters. We approached the telling of the tax story through everyday people in Ohio, Birmingham, Texas, you name it. We wanted to show the effects of the tax law through average Americans and also a diversity of Americans. And so I think one thing that we did was back in November, December, where I worked with Mei Fong, our chief strategist at the center. And the one thing we wanted to be able to tell this story is through characters. And we had to find somebody who knew that and also was very, very talented in this, and that we could hand over the production of this to, while saying, okay, these are the highlights that we want to hit. These are the main points we want to hit, but you tell us how we do this. And in your submission to do this work, that's what came out, is that you wanted to tell the story through characters.
Let me interrupt you rather.
Sure.
Let me try to ask the question a different way, which is, what was the experience for you having done all this reporting and then having to change it into this different format?
Yeah, well, the hardest thing to do was, these stories are like your children, and you have to let go. You're handing them over to somebody to continue raising them, and you have to let go. You have to let go of the control. You have to keep your ego out of it, and trust the process. Trust the people that you've hired. A lot of things don't find their way into the podcast. There are many characters, like the single mom who worked for General Motors and lost her job, the janitor in Birmingham, Alabama, who wasn't helped by a tax incentive that was in the law. We have a real estate developer in Austin, Texas, who didn't make it into it. So that's the hardest thing to do, is to kind of hand over this 2 years of work, which, you've got, it's a part of you. Seriously, it becomes your children. And also the data. I mean, we have some tremendous infographics that were developed by our data team that really help tell the story about how how donors, for example, influence the lawmakers, the Republicans in Congress, to pass this law and basically paid them off. But that's not going to make it, even though it's a great data story, analysis story. So that was the hardest thing.
Yeah, let me interrupt you one more time. So you're mentioning these characters that are not going to make it into the podcast, these infographics, these data points. Why not? They were in your text articles. Can you, for the audience, explain why we couldn't just put them into the podcast? Why couldn't we include all this data and all these characters?
Well, the way I saw it was just a different way of telling the story. You just don't have the time, and you have to really, as I learned, each episode's about half an hour. You can't go into a lot of these details, especially the numbers. I mean, numbers are deadly. But you were able, Sally, to get the most important ones in there. The $1.5 trillion, which ended up to be about $2 trillion, probably more, of debt that is going to be incurred over this period of time. But it just wasn't feasible, and it wouldn't tell the story the way we wanted it to be told. And it would be, I don't think you'd have an audience to listen to something like that.
Yeah. So one of the things, just in case for the audience, if you haven't heard the podcast takes a look at President Trump's 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And one of the many issues that Alan's team did some great reporting on is the tremendous amount of debt that this bill, that the bill offered up a major tax cut to the very wealthy and corporations. And over the next decade, the national debt is set to balloon upwards of, I think, around $2 trillion.
Yeah, 2 trillion plus, yeah.
Yeah. Any tips for other folks looking to go from text, digital text stories or print stories to audio?
Yeah. What I would say, just kind of to reiterate, it's you got to find the right people. It was wonderful working with the team. I think, Sally, you're able to grasp the subject, but yeah, the thing is, you just got to let go. And we would discuss quite frequently whether we're hitting this right tone, or if we're hitting the right, if something is correct. I think in episode 3, we had to really work on that one to make sure we got the proper chronology on that. But yeah, it's just, but other than that, you just have to, trust the people that you're hiring, that you're working with, and that have the expertise.
So we have a question for you from our audience, which is, what influences, Alan, your decisions regarding which statistics and characters you include or omit?
That was completely working with Sally. We leaned on Sally. We had an idea of who were really good characters. I'll give you Catherine Cranhold, who you'll hear from a little bit later, went into Ohio and spent a lot of time there interviewing workers who were on the factory floor. Just a little background, Trump had promised that manufacturing jobs would come back. And he told people there, don't sell your houses. We're bringing back the jobs. You're going to have great factories, a lot of work. Well, they closed the factory and people had to move. I think some had to move to Tennessee and didn't want to. Wages didn't go up. And so I was thinking these would be really perfect characters, but Sally, working with another reporter, Andres, decided to focus on American Airlines. And so that was their call. And, but they hit the right points about what the tax bill and tax law did. So it really was a collaboration and kind of letting Sally and her team figure out what works best for the podcast.
So
I hope I answered the question.
Yeah. So message for other digital text folks looking to do a podcast. You have to let go. It's like sending your kid off to college.
And you did some you took the reporting and took it a little bit further. You found, like, for example, you found someone in the Treasury Department that we did not have, who worked daily with Mnuchin and gave some really good insights. So also find good reporters, people who can really find some good sources. So you took up reporting and ran with it.
Okay. Any other tips that you would want to share or insights that you learned moving from digital to audio?
It's just that it is an incredible amount of work, well worth it, but writing just text and working on data analysis, I thought was a lot of work, but there are so many moving parts that that's what was kind of awe-inspiring, is to pull all these moving parts and all these people together. And Sally was the point person for that. And there's just no way, there's absolutely no way someone who has very little experience in this to be able to do so. But that's the other thing that struck me, is just the amount of moving parts involved.
So just to give one example of that, and then we'll move on to our other team of editors. And thank you so much, Alan.
Sure.
For people, especially during a pandemic, this became challenging, but all of the reporters, and Alan was in our 3rd episode and obviously was an incredible expert voice throughout. But we had you set up, we had to ship you a recorder, or maybe you went and picked it up during the pandemic, and then we shoved him into his closet, and I coached him over video. So he's standing in his closet surrounded by clothing and piles of sweaters and jackets, and I'm how to use a recorder. So That's part of the production work. And if it doesn't sound good, then you have to do it again and again and again. It's not like you can just delete something in Google Docs, but you actually have to re-record it and edit the audio.
It was a great soundproof room. It worked well.
Alan, thank you so much. And I know
Thank you.
Other folks in the audience have questions. We will come back to you.
All right. Thank you, Sally.
So the next editors that I want to bring in, Alan was an editor on the digital text side, and the next editors I want to bring in are our audio editors. So Curtis Fox was our day-to-day story editor, and then we had a second editor who was Allison McAdam, who was a consulting editor. So I first want to start with Curtis. Curtis has probably worked on things that you have heard from podcasts like Ear Hustle. He's been, helped start podcasts at the New Yorker. I think when we first worked together many years ago, it was the Poetry Foundation. Curtis, you've had so much experience. The list would take me a really long time to read.
And we worked together on the Parents Magazine podcast.
Yes, we did. Oh my God. So I guess a lot of people, when they hear editor, one of the things that's so interesting to me is when people hear editor, they think of someone who's cutting tape.
Right.
But an editor actually does something very different in our world. What is an editor's job?
It should be called story editor, I think, rather than editor, because Pro Tools editor is somebody who's cutting up an interview or something like that. You're right. An editor basically tries to imagine a show from the point of view of an audience. How is the audience going to take something in? Where does something begin? Where does it develop? What's going to interest them? Is it going to be clear to an audience? The editor is always trying to put himself or herself in a position of what the first time you're going to listen to this, how is it going to go down? And also the editor has to look at the organization where it's coming from. In this case, the Center for Public Integrity, to decide, does it fit with what they want and believe? Or if you're working for NPR, it's what their values and so on. So I think an editor puts themselves in the position of the audience. I think that's the main thing. And it's very hard to do that when you get deeply involved in a project, because it's hard to imagine what it's like after you've heard tape for like 15 times, what it's like to experience that tape for the first time.
And maybe that's a good point to bring in Allison McAdam, who was our consulting or contributing editor. Allison, you were at NPR for 15 years. I have to check my notes because your titles are so impressive. You were producer and then senior editor for All Things Considered. And then you actually went on to work with NPR's training team. Can you tell us, so Curtis was our story editor, and I know you also do story editing yourself, like with Believed, this amazing podcast about Larry Nassar. What does a consulting or contributing editor do? How is it different than the day-to-day story editing that Curtis did?
Well, it's not necessarily a job that has one clear description. So, but in the case of this story, I had some early interactions with you and Alan and May, and so I knew really early on what you were trying to create before any of it existed beyond the original reporting that the Center for Public Integrity had done. But then once and then I went off and worked on other projects, and then I think once you guys got started, I think that there was a sense, just like Curtis was saying, that you guys were going to be pretty heavily in the weeds with these stories, and they're really complicated and they're so intricate, and that it would help to have someone who was a much fresher ear. And so just like Curtis said, if one of the most important things an editor can do is be a stand-in for a listener, sometimes as an editor, to speak for myself, sometimes you recognize that you've lost your ability to be a stand-in for the listener, that you've gotten too into the story itself. And so I came in and joined you guys for read-throughs, listened through drafts of the episode, and tried to sort of be a more distant editor, thinking about what's not making sense, where am I losing the thread of the story, coming in knowing much less than you guys knew at that point about the specific topics.
So a question for both of you, and actually let me provide one beat of context, which I think is helpful for anyone who has not done a podcast before. Something that's really different between writing for the eye, be it print or digital, and writing for the ear. When we're editing, editors will listen first, right? They don't read your script. So I think there's a couple of misconceptions. One is sometimes that what you hear on a podcast or on public radio, that someone just turned on a recorder and started speaking, but we put tremendous amounts of time, so many hours into crafting every single word. And if it sounds natural and conversational, then we've achieved our goal. And I just wanted to make sure that was clear. So some questions are coming in for Curtis and Allison. So maybe Curtis, we'll start with you first, and then Allison, it would be great to get you to weigh in too. After having worked on a project for some time, how do you maintain enough distance from the project in order to be able to listen to it in the perspective of an audience member?
That is the hardest thing about being an editor, is to keep fresh ears on it. I don't know that there is a way, really. What we had to do in this case is bring in Allison, because I was so deeply involved, I think, in the conception of the thing and hearing the tape and so on. So what we did is we went to the A team and we went to Allison. We brought her in for those fresh ears. I don't know that I have a way to do that, other than most of the projects I edit, I do not have that kind of involvement with. I hear it once, or I'm involved in the conceptual stage of it. I hear it. I make a lot of quick advice. Then I hear it a second time, and I really am pretty fresh. In this case, it was an unusual example of really getting in there with you and working with script and working on the actualities and writing in and out of those and moving things around and really exploring different ways of doing things. So I failed.
No, you didn't. I'll just add quickly. I mean, I think this is one of the problems of one conception of an editor, is that they will always be able to have that kind of distance. I think the best editors know the point at which they actually need to turn to another editor, or just like sometimes it's your partner or it's your friend and you say, I just need someone else to listen to this because I've lost my way in it. Does this even make sense? And so I train editors, and I sort of feel like I want to give them absolution. Like, you cannot always have the distance that you need to have. The other thing that you can do if you have the time, obviously, is sort of go away from something for a while, or put it on your headphones while you take a walk. Sometimes you just need to change the context. I'm a really good listener in the car. I haven't solved the problem of how I could take notes on a draft I'm listening to in the car, but I keep thinking, gosh, if I could just edit in the car, I would have the best perspective ever. So.
Just quickly for the audience, Curtis mentioned something called actualities. And in case you don't know, actualities are the pieces that reporters and producers reported in the field. So earlier you heard somebody talking about Louise Linton or Stephen Mnuchin. Those are actualities. We also call them acts, like an axe in play, or like an axe. You'll also see slang, like the thing you chop wood with. And Curtis, just before we move forward, why do you think this was so much more involved?
I think we faced the difficult problem of how do you make a tax law interesting. I mean, and I think the initial decision that was made at the Center for Public Integrity is to focus on characters, and your initial decision was right. You have to focus on characters and then tell the story through them. Let them be the mules to tell you the story. I think. And then we got involved with how to structure each one so that we could keep people with us. And I think the first episode is a good example. We decided we're going to feature the one Texas rich guy, the billionaire. And it took us a long time to get to the point where we realized we want to put him at the top of the show. We want to include him throughout the show. And he's going to be the glue that holds the whole thing together. But it took us drafts to go through that and realize, it wasn't quite working. We were too long in the front and so on and so forth. So every podcast is super difficult. You have to find its form and shape. And I've never been on a podcast that's easy to edit or produce. I haven't. And this one was particularly challenging.
Let me ask you guys a couple of really precise, like small questions that I find fascinating. And then we'll kind of zoom out and ask a really big, interesting question. Curtis, I thought I learned so much from working with you, and something that just stuck in my head. I kept hearing your voice asking, will this be fatiguing for the listener? Can you talk a little bit about what that means? I think one example of that is I wanted to put in a lot of different voices, right? Because sort of like Alan talked about, this is a complicated subject. It's about the president. It's about tax policy. I went and interviewed a bunch of people. The Center for Public Integrity had done tons of interview and legwork. And so we had all this tape and all these voices, and I tried to shove them all in. And you said that will be fatiguing for the listener. What does that mean?
Well, we all know the experience when you're listening to something and you're following along and you're getting the gist of the story. Then all of a sudden it just takes one too many turns and your mind just clicks off, and then a lot of language goes by which you don't pay attention to, and then when you finally rejoin it, you've lost the thread entirely. So I think in audio, that's an easy mistake to make, is to pile too much in there. And we could do that in news pieces, because news pieces are largely ideas based, and you can go bounce from person to person to person. But if you do that for 8, 10, 12, 15 minutes at a time in a podcast, it is going to be exhausting beyond belief. And it's just not going to, you're just going to lose people. So my goal as an editor is, how do you not lose people? How do you present information in a way that's going to bring your people along with you?
And Allison, do you want to weigh in on this idea of fatiguing listener? I think you have some thoughts on this, right? Because you spent a really long time at NPR, where there are a lot of these really short feature stories, like 3.5-minute stories, 2-minute stories. And we do, reporters, I've done these stories, we do have a tendency to like pack them with voices. Is that okay? What do you think?
Every story is different. It's always really hard to say, like, this is the way you do it and this is not the way you do it. You know, we do whole stories that are all montagey and filled with voices, and they can be incredibly legible. But I think that in a way, the same logic goes for a short piece and for a 30-minute piece, that it needs some kind of shape, and it needs some kind of shape that's legible to the listener. So if you are moving from voice to voice to voice, you know why, and you're able to understand what that person's presence means. But I do think, you know, just to sort of reinforce what Curtis is saying, that one of the joys of being able to spend more time with a story is that you can get to know someone, and you can get to follow them or be with them on a little bit of a journey. And what that means is that you lose other things. And you know, I think sometimes about print reporting, and there are very accomplished print reporters on this Zoom, and I would not be one of them, but my sense is that there is a ton of reporting you do that doesn't necessarily end up in a print piece. And I think that the same logic should exist in audio. Whereas I think a lot of times, once you've asked somebody to be recorded for an interview, you feel a lot of times there's a sort of an obligatory sense that, oh, well, we need to, like, but I feel really bad because this person spent an hour talking to me and went to a studio, or, you know, something like that. And you can't put voices in for that. Like, anything obligatory tends to be a red flag for your narrative. And so you often spend time with less people because you can be with them and understand them.
So to share what it's like to work with an editor, I have a screenshot of a very specific edit that Allison made. This has to do with the word shedding. So I love this. Let me see. So we were listening through to the story, and I was like, oh, this story is in great shape. This was, I think, the 4th episode in our podcast about American Airlines, and Curtis and I had been through it. And Allison suggested, and the reporter on this was the very talented Andres Caballero, who's also an amazing documentary filmmaker. And he had written this line that American Airlines was shedding $70 million. Can you tell us why you suggested changing shedding to leaking?
Sure. I think you correct me if my memory is wrong, but I'm pretty sure that my point was that the connotation of shedding was a sort of a good and natural and healthy thing. As a dog lover, of course, I think about my beloved dog, or you think about, you know, animals that shed their skin. And what we were talking about was not a good thing. It was a problem. It was a deficit. And so I said that for purposes of connotation, and I promise I'm not always that nitpicky. I have bigger thoughts too, but.
No, I think this is great. And I think this is such a great example of why it's so helpful to have an editor, because after hearing something 5 million times, like you just can't see the forest for the trees, right? Like this is just, I can't tell, like I needed Curtis to tell me when something was fatiguing. I needed you to tell us, we should use losing instead of shedding. Very quickly to answer 2 questions from the audience, which are a little technical. The difference between a podcast editor. So you've heard, I love Curtis's suggestion of calling the editor the story editor, someone who's helping you shape the piece and ask big questions, and are they the right questions, and is the language correct? And there's another job called a director. Traditionally, a director would be in broadcast radio in the studio directing a show and counting in the host. And if Allison was the host or Curtis was the host, saying, Curtis, we're going live in 3, 2, 1. That's the director. The other technical question actually brings up a slightly bigger point. Podcasting takes a team, as we mentioned at the top. And in fact, we have so many amazing team members, we could not fit them all into this call because there are too many. And so we had an engineer whose job it was to work with the sound, a wonderful guy by the name of Peregrine. His name is amazing, in the United Kingdom with Nina. And once we were very, very close to finish. So the question is, what was the workflow like between story editors and audio editors? But I think what the person who's asking the question means is, what was the workflow like between the story editor and the engineer, the person who was preparing the sound for broadcast? We went to the engineer when we were 99% done, had them do a mix, and then Curtis and I listened again for final changes. So big question for Curtis and Allison. Maybe we'll start, Curtis, with you first, and then we'll come to you, Allison. I wrote this down. So there's a lot of interest in the podcast space right now. A lot of podcasts are being green lit, and people want narrative stories, these like jazzy, exciting narrative podcasts. How do you balance the information with the need to make it interesting or entertaining? How do you decide what to keep and what to lose, right? There's this fascinating tension between storytelling and reporting. We have to tell a factual, accurate story, but we also don't want people to turn it off and go to sleep if we just start talking about a tax bill. So Kurt, first, do you have any tips?
I don't. I come more from the storytelling tradition, where I'm very much. I've done a lot of fiction, for example. So I really need a good story to keep me in a podcast. But journalistically, obviously, you cannot bend the facts out of. You can't go on with with an idea of how it's going to work, and expect it to work out exactly in the final mix. And I think that's where a lot of podcasts can run into a problem. They have a great idea they have a great story, and they do the reporting, they force their reporting into the story, and maybe not let the reporting lead you in a different direction and tell even a better story. There's risks involved with that. I think the New York Times recently came across some problems with that with their Caliphate podcast, where they didn't maybe fact check well enough about the central character. I don't have profound things to say that. It's just that it's always a tension. It's always a problem. And I always, I don't always, but I tend to favor the storytelling. I mean, quite frankly, I want it to be a good story. So.
But we can't have a caliphate situation.
No, you can't do that. Then you'd be in the New York Times and having to explain yourself. It'd be terrible.
Yeah. Allison, any thoughts about this tension?
I mean, I have 4 hours of thoughts, but I will try and just say something brief and useful for the audience, which is that I think whatever project you're working on, I think it's really important to weigh very early in the process what you want your balance to be. There's a lot of overlaps between journalism and storytelling. Is it a Venn diagram? Is it a spectrum? You could think about it however you want, but I think each story has a slightly different way of finding that balance. But you need to be really intentional about it. In long form audio, you have the benefit of being able to really kind of break the fourth wall and speak directly to your audience. And you could also do this in radio, to be clear. And you can say, you know, this thing over here, this is really complicated, and we're going to try and explain it to you. Stick with us. You know, there might even have been moments in The Heist where we felt like we had to do that. And there's other times when you say, this thing over here is too complicated. We haven't found a way to integrate it into our story. We just need to narrow our story, but make sure it's still accurate. But I think that the paradox a little bit here is you think you have all this time, but really what you need to do with a 30-minute story is narrow your focal point. So, you know, you guys were talking about Doug Deason, the Republican donor in episode 1. Episode 1 really needed to be Doug Deason's story. He couldn't just pop up here and there and be kind of a you know, intriguing guy. You know, there's a much broader story that we might have tried to tell about dark money and you know, political donations. But I think it actually would have ultimately conveyed less information because it didn't have a focal point and something to kind of, I think about sometimes about scaffolding, and it's like you need, like, think about rock climbing. It's like you actually need a hold to put your hand on, you know, and a character is that hold. You can't climb a flat wall. So the minute you catch yourself sort of thinking big because you think you have so much time, you have to bring it back to like who or what is the focal point? What is the central question? And then you can kind of breathe from there.
Great. One sort of medium-sized question for the two of you now. So in our second episode, we go on a hunt for Steven Mnuchin, like I mentioned earlier, the Secretary of the Treasury, sort of this mysterious character. And as a person who spent my career in very traditional journalism, reporting short features for economics programs like Marketplace, aired nationally on NPR about, you know, orange juice futures or the price of soybeans or steak, my tendency was not only to shove a lot of tape in, but to leave myself very much out of the story. So Curtis, I want to start with you because you had to, as the editor, part of your job was to, you know, help me to set the tone, right? And to, in addition to the framing, the structure, the writing, you had me put myself in it. Can you talk about why and to what extent you had me put myself in it as a character? And then Allison, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on when that's okay to put a reporter in as a character as well.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you had nothing to do with the tax law and the gigantic giveaway to wealthy people, but I think the audio works well when there's a connection with the person telling the story. We go back to radio shows because we like the host. We go back to podcasts. We tolerate terrible episodes because we like the host. And I think it would be a mistake to tell a story like this completely objectively, because you kind of are a character for the audience, and to introduce your own, I wouldn't say subjectivity, but a certain amount of interest. Why you're compelled to tell the story, why it's of interest. I think that just brings people along with you, and allows for a connection to take place, that essential connection between the audience and the host. I think podcasts can't live without that connection.
And especially because we have to hold the audience's interest for so much longer than a standard 3.5 minute, you know, morning news.
Yeah, exactly. And it's very different than presenting a news piece, which can be very quick. It has to be much more relaxed, I think, for the podcast host, because you can't have 30 minutes of tension. Or I guess you could, but nobody would listen to it. But
and Allison, do you have any thoughts on this, on how you handled when and to what extent a reporter or producer should have a podcast?
I definitely do. Some of them are pretty subjective. Like I have my own feelings as a listener about the point at which I feel like a reporter or a host has sort of gotten too in the mix. And it's hard to sort of offer up a perfect, you know, description of when it's sort of crossed over the line. There are some extremely popular podcasts I haven't been as much of a fan of because I didn't need that much of the host. But I think that again, it really depends on the story you're telling. I'm working on a podcast right now that is partially a memoir, and obviously there's going to be a lot of first person in there, and yet what's most compelling about it is when the host is connecting with other people. And so I think that there's not exactly, one perfect metric, but the question is, if you're really going to put yourself very front and center in a podcast, you better be incredibly interesting and compelling, or have a really, really good way of connecting with other people. I think that I think Sally's presence was pretty minimal. It just felt, there were a couple personal moments, but mostly it just felt like it was a smart friend telling you a story and walking you through a story. And so there's a difference also between getting personal in terms of, like, at one point, Sally's talking about anti-Semitism and mentions that she's Jewish, that feels like a perfectly fine thing to do. At other points, you're just using the first person because it's the way you would tell your friend this story. And that's a different kind of putting yourself in the story.
So we have a question for both of you from the audience. I think it might just need a little extra context. It's sort of what you were just both talking about. Allison, maybe we'll talk to you first and then go back to Curtis. Do you think that inserting the reporter as a character into the podcast takes away from the journalistic objectivity to some extent, whether it's intentional or not?
Well, that's a little bit of a minefield to begin with, because of how we want to think about objectivity at this point. I think, I am certainly on the side of the idea that objectivity is in itself the best, the best way to or the most serviceable way of thinking about it. At this point, there's a certain subjectivity in absolutely everything we do. I'm sure the person who asked the question, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But I do think that there is a kind of, putting yourself in a story can also put your blind spots front and center. And so it's something that you need to be careful about, depending on what you're talking about, to what degree you're claiming an intimacy with the topic, to what degree you're connecting with your characters. And I think that there are particular kinds of stories where it makes more sense than others too. So yeah, that's a little bit vague, but I'll pass to Curtis and see what he wants to add.
Restate the question again. So when do you put yourself into something?
Not when do you put yourself into it, but does it trample on journalistic objectivity?
It can, obviously, but I think I don't know. That this is one of the things that's so difficult. I've worked with a lot of print organizations over the years. This is one of the things that's really difficult to transition to. And I go back to my point that the host matters, personality matters in audio in a way that it doesn't quite in print. It's style is important, obviously, in prose, but print people, when you try to take a print product and bring it into a podcast, you have to bring personality into it. I don't think that necessarily compromises objectivity. I think it could if you make yourself too present in something. But I think that's one of the odd shifts that takes place between print and audio. Sally Herbschips becomes a character in her own podcast, inevitably. And then the Center for Public Integrity has to trust her that she can tell the story in an objective way. I think you achieved that.
Very last question, and then we're going to transition on to our next very exciting guest. For both of you, top pet peeve, or maybe just whatever your pet peeve is as an editor that's top of mind today. Curtis, and then Allison. Oh,
I just struck it out of somebody's script today when a host says, "I'm your host." I'm your host, Sally Herbschips. I know you're the host. This is top pet peeve. Second pet peeve is pod. I hate calling them pods. But anyway.
Thank you, and Allison.
I got more.
The best one that I can tell you, I'm actually gonna 100% credit my husband, who is possibly even spends more time listening to podcasts than I do. And so we talk a lot about them. And he started telling me every time he heard someone say, "This changed everything." And I have probably written some version of this line myself, but now I can't unhear my husband pointing out that we way overuse it. And it's just, I'm sure one of many overused phrases, but you're going to start now. We hear it a lot. So yeah, I might have cut it out of something, and I can't remember if I cut it out of one of our episodes, but.
Do I look guilty? Maybe. I'm so glad I was hoping you would say that. Curtis, thank you both so much. Just to give listeners a little, another example of the extent of the work that they were doing, both Curtis and Allison helped us to edit even the little podcast descriptions you see in iTunes, like an Apple Podcast. Like every single word has been scrutinized by multiple people. Thank you both so much.
My pleasure.
Sally.
All right, our next team member is reporter Catherine Cranhold. She was one of the two co-hosts and reporters of our last episode on the PPP, the government's payroll protection plan. And before her investigative work for the Center for Public Integrity, Catherine was a staff reporter for the Wall Street Journal and for the Hartford Courant. She doesn't know this because I haven't told her, but when I imagine her, she's wearing a superhero outfit with a big I for investigative reporter. So Catherine, welcome. Thanks,
Sally. Hi.
Hi. Let me see.
So I love hearing Curtis talk, because on our editing calls, he's so precise and discreet, and he did not talk as much as he did today. So it was really fun to hear his pet peeve, and also hear from Allison too, and of course my editor Alan Holmes. So it's great to be here with everyone.
So fun fact about Catherine, this was her very first podcast. She's this incredibly experienced investigative journalist who knows how to get hold of amazing documents. But you haven't worked on a podcast before. My first question is, what was it like to write for The Ear?
Well, I mean, as we know, I kind of agree. I can say I can echo a lot of what Allison says about story. I mean, I feel like podcasts written, we're all writing, and I read my stories out loud when I'm writing them. I read the lead out loud because I want to make sure, I just want to hear how it sounds. Obviously that very different here. It was hard. I think my big concern was that we wouldn't get in certain details. We wouldn't be able to feature as much of, like the Rivieras. So in writing I'm trying to think of writing for The Ear. First I went to the first draft with Robin Amer, and who's co-reporter and who's not here today. She just had a baby. And it was fun. I mean, it was fun kind of talking through the script with her. And then Sally and I did a complete another rewrite together. And I love the collaborative process. Alan Holmes and I have spent the last couple of years just going through line by line of the story. So to me, it's a collaborative process, and it's more when you say write for Ear, yes, because we're using words that a little less precise at times, maybe, or less, you're not going to use the same adjectives you're going to use in the written word. So yeah, you are, as you say, Sally, you're writing for The Ear, so you're making it much more conversational. Whereas Al and I are writing a paragraph, and we want it to sound well and read well, but we're not drawing someone into a podcast. So
was it hard? Was it easy? Was it different than you?
It was just different. I don't consider it more or less. I don't know that it was actually hard in that respect. It was different. I love collaborating, and so it was a lot of fun for me to get again work with Robin, and then work with you, and see what your process is, and then with Curtis, And, before I started working with them, I also listened to some podcasts of Sally's. I listened to Robin Amer's The City, which she did when she was USA Today. I listened to Curtis's, his poetry ones, Off the Shelf, Drinking Poetry, which I love. So I could get a sense for, there's your style and everyone else's style. Just in terms of your voice, because you're all so different in your voice and how you frame things, and when you go up and just like an actor too, you're very different in your voices.
And speaking of voicing, how did you find, as someone who hasn't done this before, I'm trying to think of like what's helpful for the audience, anyone out there?
I was very self-conscious, definitely. I mean, I've done TV, I've done NBC, CNBC, I've been on, but to narrate there, you're getting interviewed. And I was very self-conscious, I think, at first. And of course, Sally had me, had me go into actually recording studio, which was great. And I, did 4 or 5 takes of the same paragraph. And, you're just, first time out, you're self-conscious. And I definitely was. I live here in LA, so I have a lot of friends who are in the entertainment film actors and worked with David Finch and Gore Verbinski. And so I would tell them, I told them about my experience, and they kind of laughed at me because they're like, oh, we do 50 takes of a scene. So they tried to make me feel better, but it was, that was if anything, that was the most self-conscious part, because you're learning a new tool, you're learning something entirely new.
Do you have a tip for other digital writers or print writers who are thinking of trying to write for the ear, like write their first podcast, or are worried about narrating their first podcast?
I think, find great collaborators. I mean, one thing Robin certainly said to me, she worked with print reporters at USA Today, is that, the first time, like the first episode she did with people, they, like me, were more self-conscious, but as they worked through it, they got much more confident in their voice and who they were and their kind of what persona they were putting out there. So I would say, like you all have been doing this for years. You're on radio. You have a clear voice, Sally. I mean, Curtis does. I haven't heard Allison. I know Alan Holmes and I talked a lot about this. I think, frankly, it's about everything's just doing it many times over before it's like writing a story. It's just doing it and having the experience. So I don't think anyone, I'd be surprised if many people on the first time out just hit it out of the park.
I think that's actually great advice. I was talking with a student recently. I teach audio I hear this a lot from students. They try something the first time and are surprised that it isn't perfect. And I'm like, well, if you were taking an opera singing class, after a day of opera singing, would you expect to be on the stage of the Metropolitan? Probably not. Or what about pottery? Like your first pot might look a little funny. It's just practice. Practice makes perfect.
But I do think that storytelling, if you're a great journalist, the storytelling's the same. You better have great facts, great characters, a great narrative to tell. And to me, that's no different with the podcast. You and Curtis are the editors. So you wanted to focus, you guys, just like Alan Holmes, my editor on the stories, certainly I'm used to being edited, and I worked with so many great editors at the Journal that you go back and forth on what's going to work. I would have loved to have more of the Riveras in it, because I love the Riveras. They're the couple that couldn't get alone. But I think, both you and Curtis felt, it wasn't strong enough tape with them. Whereas it was probably in the written word, we could, there's just so much interview time with them that we could have, there's a lot more you can pull from with the written versus on tape where you're listening and there's less you can actually use. I think that's probably one big difference, is that there's more material that you can actually use.
We like to say we need good talkers. We need were really compelling and, you know, are going to hold onto our ears. They're interesting to listen to. And if you find a good talker, that's golden tape. But if somebody is not a great talker, it might work in a text article, but it does not. We're going to cut the tape a lot of it.
Right. So that was like, oh, I was, frustrated because I know I wanted to, there were certain pieces that, again, we couldn't, didn't work for the ear in terms of audio that would have been, that in fact, even in the text story we did for the website, I used a tax expert who's amazing tax expert that we didn't use in the audio, but we anyway. Thank you all for partnering with me on this, and thank you, Alan Holmes. We spent a lot of time reporting this before we got to this point, so it's exciting to see what you guys were able to do in 5 episodes.
So we didn't mention it at the time, but I could tell, or didn't mention at the time, but I could tell when we started working together, you were very worried. What were you worried about something? Do you want to talk a little bit about your concerns?
Sure. I think, again, as a longtime investigative reporter, and I took a detour for a few years out, but going back to it, I have a certain way of working of, reporting, finding sources, finding characters, finding documents, and so to find the Riveras and my longtime source, Matt Gardner, who's featured in the piece. I have a certain way of working. Alan Holmes and I completely are in sync on how we work and how we approach stories. So we hadn't worked together before, and I'm thinking, I've heard like a 2 or 3 minute spot with you, so I didn't know, frankly, how you approach stories and reporting. So that certainly, when you haven't worked with someone before, you want to test them, and same with Robin. So Robin and I had to dig in together immediately, Robin Amer and I, and see how, what kind of depth of reporting we do. And it was great because we saw things very much on the same level, and what kind of facts we needed, what kind of characters we needed. And I think just starting out, not working together.
That makes total sense. So Catherine, as she's mentioned, her co-producer, co-host on the episode, they reported on the PPP program as Robin Amer, great reporter in Chicago. And this is a really complicated story, right? On a plan that, the Paycheck Protection Plan launched during the pandemic, the country's in the greatest financial crisis since the Great Depression. How much data and tape and characters and numbers got left on the cutting room floor, and how does that compare to a print article or text article?
I think, obviously a huge amount got left on the floor, but not as much as you would think. I think that we got in some critical elements for Continental in terms of what we found in terms of documents. I think probably what didn't get in, we would have wanted to get in more about the banks, number one, more about what the banks, how they made money on this program, how the banks really took advantage of the program, and where they, we could have gotten into a lot more data about the banks, and also more data about who got the loans, who didn't get the loans. Certainly, this is an inequality story. Black-owned and Hispanic-owned businesses got very small percentage of the loans, especially in the beginning. I think we could have, it would have been tough to give much more detail, but there was a lot of data there that I would have loved to be able to share that we did put into some stories, into some written stories. There definitely a lot more that we would have told through people too. We wouldn't have just put the data in. We would have found additional individuals, characters to help to illustrate that data.
Do you feel like you've walked away, and this is again thinking through the eyes of other text writers, do you think you've walked away with any new skills in particular?
Oh, definitely. One, just the whole process understanding, I think like Alan Holmes said, the amount of work, the amount of work that goes into this, it's just, the process, even just cutting the tape. I know when we were trying to find a new clip for the PPP program, you had Camille and Lucas go back in and find additional clips. I think that, using Pro Tools. I mean, I didn't really use them, but, I did get exposed to them. So, there's that kind of just nuts and bolts type of process work that I know you're going to talk about here later. But I think that some of that nuts and bolts that goes into also film editing and into that film podcast is the production of it. Just seeing that process, I really have a new appreciation for just the process. And I think, again, the reporting is very similar, and what we're driving to do is the same. And again, though, but then going to the recording, the self-recording, the narrative is to me, it was the new skill for myself.
Right. We also tried to shove you into a closet or something.
Yeah, that didn't work. They didn't shove me. They shoved me in the closet. They finally, I think Curtis said, let's get her to a recording studio because we need her someplace where we can coach her and give her feedback and make it a little easier. So I went to a recording studio, which was a lot of fun to go in and do it.
Yeah, and just for other text reporters out there who haven't, or if people who haven't done a podcast before, the kinds of little things that you need to think about when you're first recording and maybe you're not able to go into a studio, things like, do I have an SD card for my recorder? Do I have extra batteries? Do I have a way of getting the tape that I recorded from the SD card off of the SD card into the computer? Do I have a quiet, pretty much soundproof place to record? Is there going to be interference from an internet connection, which distorts the audio? All of these things, are these tiny little things, are steps in the process, which I encourage you to think about.
Because it's a time consuming. It's not, again, that is the time consuming part. It's not, it's not just recording an interview, although I transcribe my interviews myself because I like hearing them a second and third and fourth time, so I can really kind of just know the interview by heart when I do a text story. I like knowing, it inside out, but yeah.
Any last thoughts you want to share about your very first podcast ever?
No, it was great. Thank you all. And thank you, Allison, for your wonderful edits in the end. And thanks, Sally.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Hey. The next person that I want to introduce, I'm kind of fascinated by this. This is a wonderfully talented producer by the name of Sarah Wyman, who is beaming in from California on the West Coast. And what Sarah did was she stepped in to co-write an episode. Sarah has been most recently heading Business Insider's audio team and is a real pro at doing long-form narrative audio storytelling. So Sarah, I think the question, we decided to bring you in, we were in the middle of production, really worried about meeting deadlines. The pandemic had hit, things got a little crunchy. And so I think we turned over to you just a massive pile of tape, an outline, and kind of said please write a script. How did you do that? You hadn't done any of the reporting yourself.
Well, I think it starts with the tape, really. I think most good stories do. And what we did early on, just from a technical standpoint, that was super helpful was you gave me kind of a roadmap to your tape. So you told me these are the characters, and this is what I see every voice's role being in the story. And so I think as somebody who kind of parachuted in and crafted that into a story, that was a really helpful guide, because I knew from the get-go both broadly what kind of story we were going to tell, and then who the players were and what the kind of emphasis within that narrative had to look like. And then I think writing most things after that, it was just starting with the tape, right? And finding the best pieces of it and then building the story around that.
And I would like to play a clip. One of my favorite scenes that Sarah wrote is this scene when Mitch McConnell is really excited. He's all jazzed because the Republicans finally get to pass their tax bill, and they're really excited about it because they haven't had any luck passing legislation, even though they have a Republican president. They've taken the House and the Senate. So technically they should be able to get things done, and that is not happening. So let's play this clip, and then I want to ask Sarah some questions about it.
So when December 1st, 2017 rolled around, Mitch McConnell was ready to rock and roll. He had some good news to share. While 13 Republican senators struggled to fit on the stage behind him, McConnell adjusted the microphone on the podium in the White House press briefing room. He pushed his glasses up onto his nose.
Well, this is a great day for the country.
It was like watching someone get ready to blow out the candles on their birthday cake. And it looked like the senators behind him were dressed for the occasion. They were mostly in matching black suits and red ties. They were smiling and nodding and laughing at each other's jokes.
Let me ask you this question, because my mom, hi Mom, if you're watching, I love you so much. My mom sometimes will ask me, sounding very surprised, oh, did you write your story? And I'll get kind of insulted and my feathers ruffled and say, of course I wrote my story. I'm the reporter. Reporters write their own stories. But then there's this weird alternate universe where sometimes the voice you're hearing did not write the story. You've been a long time, you've done a lot of producing and writing. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, who's writing this stuff?
Yeah, I think anytime you listen to any kind of narrative podcast that's scripted and is as ambitious as this one is, many hands have touched it. It's very rarely, even stories that I write as a reporter now, there are editors who help me shape the language, and there are other reporters who help take pieces of it too. So it's collaborative. And I think what becomes important in that process is making sure that everyone's writing the same story. So I guess to be concrete in this example, like what was helpful was you and I checked in very often, and we checked in with our team of editors too, to kind of make sure that A, I was delivering on the points that the story needed to deliver on, and then B, that it was sounding like the rest of the series, that your voice was in it, even though I was the one writing it. But yeah, in general, I think it's very normal for that to happen across the podcasting world. I think I've certainly never worked at a place where one person has just taken a story and done everything from start to finish. I think that would be really difficult to do and would probably take years.
And part of the dance that goes on here is, so, like Sarah said, this is really collaborative. The Center for Public Integrity had done a bunch of reporting for this episode. This is our third episode about how the tax bill gets passed. And then I did some interviews and some reporting, and then I wrote an outline and pulled some favorite clips of tape and handed it off to Sarah. Then she wrote a script and gave it back to me. So that's how the workflow is going. And she had written this incredibly beautiful script. And then I had to tweak it in places to work for my own voice. So what you heard just now was very close to what Sarah wrote, with tiny little changes, because when we're writing for the ear, we have to write for our own voices. And I just want to share a comment from the chat. Someone wrote, they love this part. The blow out the candles line really stayed with me. And then another question that came in from the chat, Sarah. So this episode was about the passage of a tax bill. How did you translate facts and numbers into a compelling story?
I tried to think about it really visually, which I think was helpful. And so, and I think often where things get abstract and difficult to follow in audio and in anything is when you can't, like Allison was saying, you need a grip in the rock wall, right? Like you need something that you can imagine or feel or touch. And so one example is, like, very late in the story, we're talking about how the tax bill actually worked after it was implemented, right? After it became law, like who it affected and who benefited and who lost. And that part is written like a ladder, right? Like we're talking about, imagine a ladder and imagine you're climbing down the ladder. And that, I hope, was a moment where I tried to translate something that felt very abstract to me into something visual, and almost kinetic, right? Like you can imagine yourself participating in that. And I think it's easier to understand things when you provide They talk about that with teaching, right? That there are auditory listeners, or auditory learners, there are visual learners, and then there are like kinetic learners. And I think as a writer, you have to do that work for your audience in audio journalism too, right? Like you have to give everyone an in. Not everyone is going to be a person who just listens from hearing things. Some people need to see the things. Some people need to feel the thing. And it's your job to kind of provide those entrances.
And I think that's what you did so nicely with that clip we just heard about Mitch McConnell. And he's like, I'm trying to remember, I think your original script had a moment where you said he like pushed his glasses up onto the bridge of his nose. And I was like, that is beautiful. I can't read that, so maybe cut that out. Do you want to talk a little bit? I think your job here was a little bit of a hybrid. So in a minute, we're going to talk to the producers, the unsung heroes of the podcasting world. But you were a co-writer of this episode, but producers can also co-write. What is a producer?
Oh man, that's a great question. I think it varies a great deal from place to place. Producers are the people who make the things that you listen to. And that can mean a lot of different things. Producers sometimes report, producers often write, producers often research, like a lot of research, a lot of pulling tape. I guess I would think of it as like, producers are kind of creating the ground, the framework that the podcast gets to live on, is what happens. And so, yeah, I think what ended up being different in this role, often when you're a producer, you're more involved in the reporting process than I was here. So I can't take any credit for all of the excellent tape in that episode. That was just gifted to me, and then I got to turn it into a script. But usually when I work as a producer, I'm more involved in conceptualizing the story and in gathering the tape and in casting and finding characters and all of that. I think that's I think producers are more integral to the process ultimately every step of the way than a scriptwriter would be.
And was there anything that stood out to you about the process, or you felt like was a moment you would like to share for anyone in the audience who has not produced a podcast before, like a producer's and insider's tip for someone who's considering writing a long form podcast?
Yeah, I think it's important not to structure your story in terms of ideas right off the bat. And what I mean by that is the way this story started, like when we had a blank document, the way it started was with characters. That's what we started with, is you'd given me a list of everyone you'd talk to and what you'd talk to them about. And really what that's shorthand for is the tape that's going to be in the story. That's what that's summarizing. And I think if either of us had come in and just decided to write an episode about tax laws as a topic, if that had been the place that we started from, is great, the tax bill, what is the tax bill? How did it happen? I think this episode would have been really different. And I think it would have been a lot harder to listen to. And I think the things that made it successful ultimately were that it was driven by characters, right? It was driven by voices, by people who we care about, and that it was driven by the tape, by the best parts of the things that they told us. And I think that's important no matter what you're writing, even if it's not as dense as taxes are. I think good audio stories do that.
Great. Sarah, is there anything else you want to share?
No, I'm all done. I'm excited to hear from the producers.
Thank you so much. Okay, up next, the portion of the evening we have all been waiting for, the unsung heroes of the podcast and public radio world, the producers. I have a little list here. So we have with us Ali Swenson, Brett Joseph, Lucas Brady Woods, and Brett Forrest. I think we have maybe a typo in our graphic. So Ali, maybe do you guys want to just all come on and we can see you? And yes, now I see Brett's whole name on the slide. Sorry about that. Do you guys want to just come all on to video and we can see you and you can wave? Are we all there? Do we have our producers? Did we lose our producers?
I'm here. Can you see me?
Ali, yes, great. Okay, you were our first producer before you got snatched away from us by the Associated Press. Do you want to talk a little bit? Sarah's job involved writing a script. She came in very late in the game. You were with us much closer to the beginning. What was your job? What did you do as a producer?
Sure. So I liked what Sarah said about producers, how they build the framework that the podcast gets to live on, because I think that's a good way of thinking about the work that I did, especially at the beginning. So this was, very early in the coronavirus pandemic. We didn't really know, we had a sense of what the story would be about, but we didn't know how it would resolve itself yet. So really my job was just to go on treasure hunts for the best tape, characters, content that I could. And then hopefully that could all be molded into a podcast. So that ranged for everything from, reaching out to people who might have known Steven Mnuchin in the past and pre-interviewing them and scheduling interviews for them, to gathering tape from long C-SPAN videos of testimony, to doing research on financial contributions to politicians, basically you name it. Whatever needed to be done, I was there to do it.
My favorite moment is that you got Alan Arkin's email address. Alan Arkin, the Hollywood movie star. So that was something. So like we talked about earlier, Steven Mnuchin, Secretary of the Treasury, was a big investor in Hollywood. And when I learned that as a reporter, I thought it might be interesting to talk to some of the people who'd worked on films with him. He had all these executive producer credits. I didn't know enough about Hollywood at the time to realize that executive producer credits are handed out like candy to anyone who writes a check, and they're not really very meaningful. But before I learned that, I asked Allie to track down some movie stars. How did you do that?
Well, I was lucky enough to have some connections there because I went to my undergrad in LA. So I had some people that I could ask to pull some strings to find those numbers. Otherwise, it would have been pretty tricky.
And so the jobs, just to recap, the jobs that you had to do, you had to pull tape, book guests, and you also did a little bit, we started trying to train you to do what's called track, to help reporters record narration. Can you explain to viewers what it means to track a reporter, and maybe give some context, like why can't a reporter do that by themselves?
Yeah, sure. So basically the tracking, for people who don't know, is the voiceover part of a podcast. So it's the host actually talking and telling the story around all the different pieces of tape. So the production side of that is sitting in a booth, or in our case, virtually in a booth, with the host and walking them through the script and giving them notes as they go. Maybe you need to say this again in a slightly different way. Could you try saying this a little bit slower? I think sometimes when you're tracking by yourself, it's hard to hear those little nuances. So having a producer in the room really helps.
And do you think there are skills that cross over? I think, like I mentioned earlier, so I teach journalism, and I think when people leave school, a lot of people want to be a reporter, of course. Do you think there are crossover skills between being a producer and a journalist and a reporter? Is it the same thing?
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about a lot of the work that I was doing on the production side, a lot of it was tracking people down and trying to reach out to them to see if they'd be willing to talk to us for the podcast. And that is all reporting skills. Also, just the background research that I was doing definitely required knowing where public records were and what kinds of things I needed to do to find access to all these different resources. So all my reporting skills from school translated very well to this job.
And one of the things you were so helpful with was finding people who had known Steven Mnuchin earlier in his life. And people were really afraid to talk about him. How did you write to people? How did you reach out to them to try to persuade them?
Yeah, I mean, I did have to do a lot of cold calling and cold emailing, and I found people in all different places, from his college newspaper staff, executive board, to people who had written a letter about him to the Trump administration that had gone to his high school. So I just found all these different names and tried to just leave no stone unturned and reach out to everybody. And the way that I reached out to them is I just said, we're working on a podcast that deals with money in the Trump administration, and Steven Mnuchin is a big part of that. We're trying to get a little bit more context for, how he got to that role. And then once I got them on the phone, I would talk to them about, what exactly we were doing and how they may have known him. And, I would gauge what they were comfortable with and what they weren't.
Let's zoom in on that moment for just a minute when you're talking about you would gauge what they were comfortable with and what they weren't. So we just had this question from someone in the audience. Did you encounter any hesitation from individuals you reached out to?
Absolutely. And I think we even hear that in the final version of the podcast, right? There was somebody who wanted to talk about Steven Mnuchin, but didn't want to be on the record, at least at first, wanted to kind of speak freely on background and then potentially have some of that added back in. So yeah, I mean, I think those were always discussions that I was having with people. And certainly when the Treasury Secretary is the person that you knew in high school, and that person can have such serious implications on your life and your finances, you might be hesitant to talk about it.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that we did encounter many people who are afraid to talk. And if you listen to the podcast, we handle that in different ways. There are people who let their voices be recorded, some people who Allie tracked down, but we didn't share their full name because they're afraid of retribution. There's somebody who worked with Mnuchin on a daily basis at the Treasury, who was very forthcoming, but very concerned about that he would lose his job or retribution, professional retribution. Steven Mnuchin, like we say in the podcast, is the guy who runs the IRS. No one wants to be audited. So in the case of the guy who works with him at the Treasury, what we did was we had an actor read his part. So there are a lot of different ways you can kind of develop trust with a source over time and then negotiate, like Allie said, gauge what they're comfortable with and negotiate something that feels comfortable to everyone. Allie, any tips for people looking to do podcasts? Maybe someone who thinks, oh, I can make a podcast like by myself. What do you think about that?
I think you need a team. Absolutely. I mean, just going to these weekly meetings in the short time that I was producing on this podcast, I could see how everybody was playing their own unique role, as we've talked about this last couple of hours. And without even one of those pieces of the puzzle, you don't get the complete podcast that we ended up with. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge undertaking and you need as much help as you can get.
Great. Thank you so much, Allie. All right. I think we are getting ready to wrap up. And I just want to recap before I recap, I just want to say one thing, which is obviously it depends on the kind of podcast you're producing. This podcast was really complicated. It was about taxes. It was about the presidential administration and national policy, the Treasury. But if you were looking to do a chat podcast about music or your favorite wine, you might not need such a big team. We're talking about a very specific kind of undertaking. So I hope we're not scaring anybody away. The other team members, for anyone who's wondering, the other people who are working on this, we had a fact checker who is also a lawyer, and then a lawyer, who would go through and make sure that we were not being sued. And that was also really key. And we'll just do one more call out. Are our last producers there, Brett and Lucas? Did you guys, I don't know why are you there? Are you here?
I'm here.
Oh, Brett. Okay, Brett. And Lucas, I think I see you too. Okay, so quickly before we wrap up, Brett, you had a very different kind of job, and it was Brett's job to help get the podcast out. So we made the audio, we worked with everyone, the editors, the engineer named Peregrine in London, he mixed it, he gave us an MP3, and then we had an MP3, and we gave it to Brett. And somehow Brett got it out into the world. Brett, what did you do? What was your job?
Yeah, so I had no background in doing work like that. I had the audio reporting background, but as far as the back end goes, the distribution and all that, I didn't know how that happens. I didn't know how we listen to the podcast in our ears through Apple or Spotify or whatnot. So I approached it kind of like a journalist approaching a topic you've never heard of before. I just did a deep dive research, talked to a bunch of people who've done podcasts, read a bunch of articles, blog posts, discussion boards, whatnot. and figured out how to get this uploaded. We use a platform called Podbean. And then from there, we were able to cast a wide net and get it out to every possible platform we could, because we'd have an exclusive partnership with Spotify or anything like that. So our process was to just get it out to as many distribution platforms as we could. And casting that wide net, it's been really interesting to watch the numbers on all sorts of platforms come in. And so, yeah, I had to become an expert in a short amount of time to figure out how this works. And luckily, these days podcasts are so popular, it's much easier than I'm sure it used to be.
One question, I learned something that really surprised me when you started like analyzing the statistics for the podcast. I think I probably asked you in the very beginning, how many subscribers do we have? What surprising thing did you and I learn when I asked that question?
Yeah, turns out subscriber numbers are pretty much impossible to get. You can do some tricky math to get an estimate, but podcasting doesn't have a really uniform way to measure statistics. And so the most common way in the industry now is just by number of downloads, because it's also the easiest to measure. So as far as our subscribers go, I could take a stab in the dark, but I mean, we will never know unless the platforms like Apple and Spotify want to tell us themselves. So yeah, that is a very surprising thing to learn.
I would like to do what's called signposting right now in audio, and that's where we sort of indicate something to the audience. So did you just say that we don't know how many subscribers a podcast has?
I did just say that, and yeah, we simply just can't measure how many subscribers a podcast like ours has, but we can measure the downloads. And we surpassed 100,000 downloads yesterday, which for a brand new podcast without any prior seasons or anything like that is a huge accomplishment based on all the statistics I've seen. So I'm very proud of the team for us being able to reach that milestone.
And just another question, because I think this is a part, I might be wrong, but I think this is a part that is especially mysterious to people who want to do a podcast. Like you have your MP3, do you just use, you mentioned using Podbean, do you just like upload it to iTunes? Like, what do you do with this MP3? Where do you put it?
Yeah, so the process for the first episode to launch a show is a bit tedious. You have to go, so you use Podbean as kind of the central distributor, and then you get the RSS feed, we call it. And I had to go into each different platform like Apple or Spotify or Google, Pocket Cast. There's so many these days, there's dozens. And I had to individually input the RSS feed, get approval from them. And then once I got all those approvals, I used Podbean. Each week I would just upload the episode, schedule it for a time to release overnight, and then Podbean would take it from there and just distribute it across all the platforms. So once you do the initial legwork at the beginning of the show, every episode after that was easy peasy, but it was a bit tedious at the start.
Thank you so much, Brett. Because I feel like we could do like a whole separate event about distribution and marketing and promotion and doing it yourself versus not. So we were very lucky to have you. Lucas, you were a producer sort of when we thought we were done. Lucas Brady Woods, are you with us? Hi. One of the things that I noticed when we brought you in is you had to learn Pro Tools very quickly. Is that kind of a typical thing that a producer gets asked to do?
I mean, yeah, I feel like there's different people and different teams will use different platforms and programs to edit their podcasts. You know, it's not as daunting as it may seem if you know one program and not another one. You know, there's a lot of similarities that these editing programs are based on. So I had never used Pro Tools before, but I had used Audition, and I come from a video background, actually, a film and video background. So I had a lot of experience editing video, and really for me that was where I was able to draw on that experience in order to learn Pro Tools. It was definitely challenging, and there were frustrating moments, you know, learning the different quirks of a program and the different interfaces and whatnot. But you know, other than some moments of frustration, it wasn't you know that hard of a process once you got working. I think.
for those of you who are wondering, like, wow, there's so many producers. We had hired Allie. Allie got snatched away from us by the Associated Press. Then we brought in Lucas. So it wasn't, we didn't have, 14 different producers, though some shows do. One of the other jobs you had to do, Lucas, was log tape. What does that mean?
So logging tape is when you, after the narrator or the reporter tracks their narration, like what Ali was talking about, sitting in the room and tracking the narration with somebody, that goes to a producer as a single track with all of the different takes of the different lines in it. And the producer, I would take that and I would go through and I would cut out each of the takes and label them. And that's an important point. I mean, keeping things super organized. That's how Ali and I were able to, so Ali was able to pass this off to me, was by maintaining this organizational structure that I was able to look at cold and understand what was going on, access the right files, etc. So in the logging process, once you select each take, you label them very, accurately, and you select the best ones that you think, and then you send those to the team to go over them and edit them into the final sequence.
And for young journalists who are just starting out and maybe starting off as producers or considering getting a job as producer, do you have a tip, or like what was the hardest part of the job for you?
I'd say, as somebody getting into it, really getting into producing can mean a lot of things. Whether it's like we talked about research, whether it's actually building audio stuff. So I would say just dive, especially in an atmosphere like right now with the pandemic, dive in however you can, take advantage of any opportunity, whether it's specifically what you want to do, maybe a little bit different, maybe it's, working, if you really want to work on a podcast, maybe there's a social media opportunity that might not be what you want to do exactly, but you take that's a way in, because there's a lot of different ways into producing, and a lot of different types of producing, and it's so collaborative that getting onto a team and working with the team is the best first step.
Great, thank you so much, Lucas.
Thank you.
Okay, we are going to wrap up. We have one final question from the audience, and I want to bring back our tax project editor, Alan Holmes, to answer this question, and then we will say thank you very much and good night to everybody. I'm scrolling through our chat here, trying to find this question, but I think I can summarize it. Alan, are you with us?
Yep, right here.
So the last question, this is from the audience. I think I can summarize it. Somebody asked if we were hoping that the podcast would influence the election. Oh, let me see if I have it. Yes. Are you hoping that producing this podcast will affect the election? Were those your intentions?
Well, when we first started this out, and we were talking to Sally, the whole idea was to come out right after Labor Day, when the political campaigns really start to gear up. And yeah, we wanted to get out what Trump's signature legislative success was, and let people decide if that's how they want for the next 4 years, as Sally had put in there, how power works in Trump's America. So the simple answer is yes, because that's why we launched it in September and went through October. That's what we try to do at the Center for Public Integrity. We want impact. But to tell you the truth, I don't know if there's a whole lot of undecided voters out there at this point. But overall, yes, that's what we were thinking when we started up with the podcast.
Thank you so much. I don't know if our team members are still, how many of our team members are still around? I also don't know, Union Docs, can we all wave goodbye? Well, I'm sure a lot of people have signed off because it is late in various parts of the country, and certainly in London where Nina is. It would be so cool.
Yep, we can all wave goodbye, yeah.
Let's all wave goodbye. Thanks, everybody, and thank you to Union Docs for having us. And we hope that this was helpful in giving you some insight into how our team produced the podcast. And if you haven't already, please check out The Heist. which which you can get wherever you find your podcast. Thank you so much and have a great night or day.